They say there are pains that time cannot heal, pains that the wind carries away, but the heart insists on keeping, and it is in this silence of the backlands that one of these stories was born. A story of sacrifice, loyalty, and ingratitude. A tale of real life, one of those that seem invented, but that carry the weight of a truth that only human suffering can teach. Before we can know who he was, what he lost, and what he endured, we must feel what it's like to be forgotten, what it's like to give everything and still be treated as nothing. In the backlands, where the sun beats down and the dry land exacts a heavy price for the sweat of those who work, there was a simple man with a calm gaze and a good soul. He had no riches, but he had something that few know today, true love for what he did. The cowboy lived for the cattle. He knew each ox, each calf, as if they were part of his own family. He knew the sound of thirst, the moo of fear, the rhythm of life in the corral. He didn't talk much, but his silence was full of feeling. Because for him, caring for the animals wasn't just work, it was a mission, it was devotion. But fate, that old executioner who never shows mercy, was already preparing a cruel twist. A good man often pays dearly for his kindness, and the cowboy didn't know that the same boss to whom he had dedicated years of sweat and loyalty would one day treat him as if he were disposable. While the wind blew and the cattle grazed peacefully, the shadow of ingratitude drew near. The boss, blinded by ambition, began to forget who sustained the heart of that farm. For him, numbers were worth more than people, and the cowboy, who saw the cattle as his children, came to be seen as just another expense, a burden. The story you are about to hear is not just about a man and his oxen. It's about the pain of being forgotten, the sadness of giving everything and receiving nothing. It's about the value that is lost when the heart hardens. It's about what happens when love for the simple things is replaced by vanity. Imagine the scene, a golden dawn, the sun rising timidly over the pasture, and that man in the worn hat, riding his horse with the same care as always. The cattle followed him with their eyes, as if recognizing their own protector. It was a bond that not even death could break. But that day, something was different. The silence of the boss, the coldness in their gazes, the feeling that something was about to end. And that's how this story begins, with the wind announcing change and the cowboy's heart feeling the weight of abandonment even before the words were spoken. A sad, true story, one of those that makes us reflect on the value of gratitude, humility, and the pain that contempt causes. In the backlands, where the land is harsh, men learn to swallow their tears, but the cattle sense. They perceive when the heart of those who love them is wounded. And it was in this setting, amidst the sound of the cattle horn and the smell of dust, that the cowboy began to understand that something inside him was breaking. But what he didn't know yet was that the entire backlands would one day mourn him. The backlands awoke slowly, as if respecting the silence of dawn. The still timid sun hid behind the mountains, and the cold wind cut the face of anyone who dared to begin the day before the light. It was at this hour that the cowboy was already up. While most were still asleep, he calmly saddled his horse, adjusted his worn leather hat, and headed towards the corral. The sound of hooves on the dry ground mingled with the lowing of the cattle that recognized him from afar. There was something magical in that bond, a communication that didn't need words. The cattle sensed his arrival, as if the backlands themselves breathed a sigh of relief at his presence. He didn't need a watch. Time was marked by the sounds of the farm, the roosters crowing, the cracking of leather, the banging of gates. Every movement had a meaning, every detail was important. The cowboy didn't work out of obligation. He worked out of love. He cared for the animals as if they were his own soul. He spent hours observing the behavior of each one, identifying when they were sad, when they were hungry, when they needed attention. For him, the cattle were not just livestock, they were family. The smell of the earth mixed with sweat was part of his identity. His hands, calloused by time, bore the marks of a lifetime of dedication. And even with his tired body, the cowboy's eyes shone every time he saw the healthy herd grazing peacefully under the scorching sun. This was more than work. It was a mission, and he fulfilled it with a loyalty that few would understand. While the boss slept in clean sheets, the cowboy faced the cold of dawn and the heat of midday without complaint. He didn't expect praise or rewards. What motivated him was the peace of mind, of doing what he loved. It was the sound of hooves, the lowing of the cattle, and the sound of the wind cutting through the pasture. It was the pride of being a part of it all. When the backlands were plagued by drought, the cowboy was the first to rise and the last to rest. He dug wells, carried buckets, and fed the weakest with his own hands. In times of plenty, he gave thanks in silence. In times of hardship, he endured with faith. He believed that work dignifies man and that ingratitude is the worst of miseries. The cattle followed him respectfully, as if they understood how much that man sacrificed for them. Many said the cowboy had a gift, that the cattle obeyed him even with a look. And perhaps it was true, because there was something in his presence that conveyed calm, a kind of silent, sincere, pure love. A love that the boss never understood. On the ranch, everyone knew. When the cowboy was around, everything flowed smoothly. The pasture yielded, the cattle fattened, the calves grew strong. It was as if the land surrendered to his dedication. And even so, he never boasted. He remained simple, grateful, faithful to his work. He believed that a man's worth is not measured by how much he has, but by how much he gives, without expecting anything in return. But little by little, something began to change. The boss, once present, began to distance himself. Visits to the corral became rare, and when he did appear, his gaze held the coldness of someone who no longer sees the value of what he has. The cowboy understood, but remained silent. Perhaps he believed that time would mend things, that the boss's heart would one day remember the loyalty of the one who had been there from the beginning. But time sometimes doesn't heal, it only reveals. And what time began to reveal on that farm was the difference between those who love and those who merely use. The cowboy remained steadfast, even feeling the weight of indifference. He continued waking before the sun, even without hearing the simple good morning of gratitude anymore. He continued loving what he did, even being forgotten by those who should have recognized his worth the most. There were nights when he would sit by the gate, gazing at the stars, listening to the gentle lowing of the cattle. It was in those moments that his heart mingled with the sounds of nature. He knew that his purpose lay there, that even without recognition, his mission was to care, and perhaps that's why the cattle loved him so much. When a calf fell ill, the cowboy carried it in his arms. When a cow gave birth in the middle of the bush, he spent hours by her side until he was sure they were both all right. There was no laziness, no complaint. There was a pure, almost divine love. That man saw the cattle not as wealth, but as lives under his responsibility, and that feeling made him great, even though he was simple. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who does everything from the heart, even without receiving anything in return? If so, you know what the cowboy felt, because those who truly love don't need applause. But the problem is that the world is full of bosses and increasingly empty of cowboys, and that's why this story hurts so much, because it speaks of ingratitude disguised as power and of the purity that pride tries to crush. It speaks of the man who carried the backlands on his shoulders, but who would be forgotten as if he had never existed. But that's what we're going to find out next. And before I move on, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone forgotten after giving their all? Right below, ingratitude hurts, so I know you felt that part of the story. The sun blazed that day, the kind of heat that makes your skin burn and the ground crack. The cowboy had been in the field since before dawn, mounted on his horse, guiding the cattle to the watering trough. It was just another ordinary workday, but his heart felt heavy. There was something different in the air, a strange feeling as if the wind were whispering warnings he couldn't yet understand. The oxen moved slowly. Their lowing echoed through the backlands, and the cowboy, without realizing it, was about to experience the bitterest day of his life. While he was working, the boss arrived in his new pickup truck, surrounded by strangers. They were men in suits, shoes too clean for the backlands, with clipboards in their hands and calculating looks. The cowboy, humble as always, took off his hat as a sign of respect and approached slowly. The boss didn't even look. Not a wave, not a word. He simply ordered him to step aside. "Today there's important business and I don't want any farmhand mess around," he said, in a cold voice the cowboy had never heard before. But the cowboy stood there watching from afar. His heart was heavy, trying to understand what was happening. The men measured the pasture, noted numbers, and spoke in hushed voices. The cowboy, sweat dripping down his face, felt a chill run down his spine. It was then that he heard a phrase that cut to his chest like a knife. "With this sale, we won't need so much manpower anymore." The boss replied with a dry smile, "Those old cowboys are no longer useful. Their time has passed." The world seemed to stop in that instant. The cowboy looked at the ground, and everything spun around him. Sweat mingled with the tears he tried to hide. That man, whom he admired so much, now treated him like a dead weight. As if years of loyalty, of cold nights, of open wounds healed at the cost of hard work meant absolutely nothing. When the men had left, the cowboy mustered his courage and approached. With his hat in his hands, he looked the boss in the eye and asked what was happening. The boss, impatient, replied curtly and cruelly, "I'm selling part of the farm, and I'm going to reduce the staff. The world has changed, man. I don't need so many cowboys anymore. Today it's all machines, electric fences, tracked cattle. This place isn't like it used to be." The cowboy took a deep breath, trying to suppress the lump in his throat. He wanted to speak, to explain that cattle aren't just numbers, that care, love, and human touch make all the difference. But before he could say anything, the boss interrupted him with a phrase that seemed to resonate throughout the entire backlands. "A man like you can be found in any corral." The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Even the wind stopped. The cattle, which had been grazing peacefully, raised their heads as if they understood the gravity of the moment. The cowboy's horse neighed softly, restless, and the cowboy, with teary eyes, simply lowered his head. He didn't answer, he didn't shout, he didn't defend himself. The pride of the simple man doesn't allow him to fight for dignity. He only suffers in silence. In that instant, his whole life flashed before his eyes. The cold dawns, the births of calves he helped deliver, the storms he faced alone to save the herd, the wounds on his body, the exhaustion, the love. All of that seemed to be thrown away with a single sentence, a sentence that hurt more than any wound. The boss turned his back and got into the pickup truck. The engine roared loudly, raising a cloud of dust that covered the cowboy's face. And there, under the scorching sun, he stood motionless, swallowing the dust and the pain. The bitter taste of humiliation clung to his mouth like rust. In the following days, the farm began to change. The cattle's joy seemed to have vanished along with their respect. The corral became quieter, the birdsong less frequent. The cowboy still did his work, but he was no longer the same. His laughter faded, his eyes became distant. He carried out his routine with the same dedication, but his heart was broken, and the cattle sensed it. The oxen, previously restless, began to approach him more closely. The calf he fed every day refused to eat when he was away. It was as if the animals understood that something was wrong, that the man who cared for them, The same one who always protected them now needed comfort. At night, the cowboy sat in the enclosure and looked at the starry sky. He thought about everything he had done, everything he had given, and he wondered, was it worth it? His voice was low, almost a whisper, mixed with the distant sound of the cattle. He didn't understand how someone could be so cold, how someone who had witnessed his dedication firsthand could treat him as if he were invisible. But he held no anger. A cowboy's heart knows no hatred, only pain and silence. And while the world slept, he wept softly, hidden away, so no one would see. Perhaps the boss would never know, but what he destroyed that day was not just a man's trust. It was the bond between love and work. It was the respect that kept the soul of that farm alive. And if you're still here, listening to this part of the story, tell me in the comments, have you ever been humiliated by someone who should have recognized your worth? Right? A man like you can find himself anywhere to show that you also felt the weight of those words. The day of departure arrived without warning, like rain in the middle of a drought, suddenly without time to prepare. The cowboy no longer had the same sparkle in his eyes, and the weight of his boss's disdain seemed to have turned time into an enemy. Each morning was quieter, each step in the corral slower. He walked among the cattle with the sadness of someone who knew the end was near, but tried to hide it, perhaps so as not to worry the animals. Deep down he knew the backlands would miss him, but the cattle would miss him even more. That morning, before the sun even rose, he got up. The simple room was silent, only the sound of the wind hitting the window. He carefully folded the leather clothes he had worn for years, put away his horn with the same respect one guards a relic, and walked slowly to the corral. Each step seemed like a farewell. The sound of his spurs broke the silence of the dawn, and there they were, the whole herd of cattle waiting for him, as if they sensed what was about to happen. The oxen approached slowly, surrounding the cowboy. He ran his hand over the back of one, then another, as if bidding farewell to old friends. The smell of dust, the warmth of the rising sun, the soft sound of their mooing, everything seemed to conspire to transform that moment into something eternal. He tried to be strong, but his teary eyes betrayed him. He breathed deeply, but his voice wouldn't come out. The cowboy mounted his horse and stood still, looking around. Everything he loved was there. Every piece of fence he himself had repaired, every tree shade that had sheltered him on hot afternoons, every sound of that backlands that now seemed so distant. But what hurt the most was the cattle. Those animals were more than just part of his work. They were part of his soul. When the horse began to walk, the first moo rang out loud, drawn out and painful. Then came others in chorus. The sound echoed across the field, hitting the stones, rising to the heavens like a sad prayer. It was as if the cattle were crying, and anyone who has lived in the backlands knows cattle feel. They feel when it's going to rain, they feel when there's danger, and they feel even more when they lose those who truly loved them. The cowboy stopped, looked back, and saw that scene. Dozens of oxen gathered, standing still, looking at him without moving. Some stamped their hooves on the ground, others mooed as if calling to him. The cowboy's heart broke. He pressed his hat to his chest and lowered his head. He cried like a child, without shame, without haste, without hiding it. It was the cry of someone carrying the weight of farewell, the cry of someone who knew he was leaving behind the only life he knew. The wind began to blow harder, raising dust that danced in the air. And in that mixture of wind, tears, and dust, it seemed as if even the backlands wept with it. The trees swayed slowly, the still timid sun seemed paler, and even the birds fell silent. The entire backland stopped to watch the last cowboy leave. Meanwhile, the boss watched from afar, leaning against the fence, his face hard and his heart empty. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of coldness, he didn't say a word. But inside, something hurt, even if he tried to deny it. Because the silence in the corral that morning was different. It was the silence of mourning. The horse moved forward, the sound of its hooves echoing across the dry ground. With each step, a piece of that man's story was left behind, and the cattle remained there, standing still, watching. A newborn calf, which the cowboy had helped save just days before, tried to run after it, stumbling, mooing loudly, until it was restrained by the other oxen. That was too much. The cowboy turned his face away so as not to see. He knew that place would never be the same without him. He knew that the oxen, who recognized him by the sound of his voice and the touch of his hands, would never have another like him. And he also knew that the backlands are ungrateful to those who feel too much. But even so, he left. Because a man who loses respect cannot stay, not even where he left his heart. The road was long, and the sun was already beginning to rise. The heat was scorching, but the pain burned even more. At every bend in the dirt road, the cowboy heard the distant echo of the cattle mooing, a sound that would stay with him forever, like a lament, like a living reminder that, in that backwoods region, even the cattle wept for him. And if you're feeling that tightness in your chest right now, if this part of the story reminded you of someone who said goodbye in silence, comment below, "The backlands wept with him." I want to see who truly felt the weight of that moment. The days following the cowboy's departure brought an eerie silence to the farm. It was as if the wind had stopped blowing, as if the backlands had lost their voice. The corral, once full of life, now seemed like a graveyard of memories. The cattle wandered restlessly, aimlessly. The mournful mooing of the oxen echoed through the night, mingled with the sound of the gates creaking in the dry wind. The animals seemed to be searching for something they could no longer find. They were searching for the cowboy. The boss, accustomed to having everything under control, began to perceive the emptiness he had allowed to settle in. At first, he pretended not to care. He believed that another man would do the same job, perhaps even better. He hired 2 new farmhands, people who didn't know the soul of the land or the rhythm of the cattle. They arrived late, worked without passion, and treated the animals coldly. For them, it was just another job. For the boss, it was just another way to save money. But the backlands don't forgive those who despise what is sacred. In a short time, the pasture began to change. The grass withered faster, the cattle lost weight, and the milk production decreased. The calf that the cowboy fed every day stopped eating, and the cow he always called by name distanced itself from the rest of the herd, as if sensing the absence of its friend. The farm, which once pulsed with the sound of the cattle horn and the cowboy's laughter, now breathed sadness. The silence was heavy, and even the birds seemed to have gone away. The boss began to notice the weight of this emptiness. He walked through the corral and no longer heard that respectful and simple, "Good morning, boss." Instead, there was only the creaking of the wood and the distant sound of the wind hitting the loose fences. The cowboy's absence was like an open wound, bleeding slowly. He tried to convince himself that it was better this way, that progress demands change. But progress that kills the soul of the countryside doesn't bring wealth. It brings ruin. One morning, the boss woke to the sound of a loud, unusual moo. He ran to the pasture and found one of the oxen lying down, sick. He called the new farmhands, but none of them knew what to do. They lacked the right touch, the experience, the look that understands the animal without needing words. The boss, desperate, tried to help, but the weak ox only raised its head and stared intently at him, as if asking for the man who truly cared for them. That look remained etched in the boss's mind, like a mirror reflecting his guilt. The days went by, and the weight of loneliness began to transform into regret. The boss started walking the same paths the cowboy used to take. He stopped in the same places, looked at the same horizon. Sometimes he even smelled the wet leather and heard the distant sound of the cowbell, as if the cowboy's spirit still lingered there. And perhaps it did, because sincere love doesn't fade with time. It remains trapped in the places where it was lived. One afternoon, the boss entered the corral and found the cowboy's horn forgotten in a corner. It was covered in dust, but still sturdy. He picked it up and his heart tightened. It was the same horn that called the cattle every morning. Without thinking, he brought it to his lips and blew. The sound came out weak, out of tune, but it echoed throughout the backlands. And the incredible happened. The cattle began to approach. Slowly, one by one, they gathered, mooing softly, as if answering an ancient call. The boss felt tears welling up, but he couldn't hold them back. That sound, that moment clearly showed what he had lost. Not just an employee, but the heart of the farm. From that day on, the boss stopped sleeping peacefully. At night, the silence tormented him. The sound of hooves, which had once echoed firmly in the early morning, was now just a memory. The smell of the coffee that the cowboy prepared in the morning still seemed to linger in the air. And the cattle, which had once grazed calmly, now mooed with hunger and loneliness. Everything on the farm screamed of the absence of the man who had been scorned. As the months passed, the bills began to pile up. Production fell, and buyers drifted away. The proud boss now felt the weight of his own choices. He would sit on the porch at dusk and gaze at the horizon, the same horizon the cowboy had so admired. And amidst the reddish sunset, regret burned more intensely than the heat of the backlands. And it is at this point in the story that life reveals its irony. Because the man who once thought himself the owner of everything now possessed nothing but guilt. The farm no longer responded. The cattle languished, and the silence had become a punishment. The backlands seemed to want to return, in equal measure, everything that the boss had taken. But fate still had more to teach, and the boss, now embittered, would begin to understand the true price of ingratitude. And you, who are listening to me, tell me in the comments, do you believe that the backlands exact their price? Write "the silence of the corral" if that part made you feel the boss's regret. The nights had grown cold again in the backlands. The wind that once carried the scent of the earth and the sound of the cattle horn now blew an emptiness that seemed endless. The farm was different. Life had lost its rhythm. Time moved more slowly. The boss, aged by remorse, walked alone through the corral. The ground, once beaten by the firm step of the cowboy, was now covered in dust and silence. Everything seemed still, as if the backlands had also decided to mourn. They say there are pains that time doesn't heal because they weren't born in the body, but in the soul. And the boss felt that every day. The cattle, thin and tired, looked at him with the same sadness that the man tried to hide. No sound, no movement, nothing could fill the void left by the cowboy. He was more than a worker. He was the living soul of that place. The boss began visiting the corral at dawn, as if searching for something he didn't even know what it was. Sometimes he would sit on the same fence where the cowboy used to rest and gaze at the horizon. The sky, always starry, seemed to carry a different glow, as if the backlands were watching him back. And amidst the silence, on certain mornings, he swore he heard a distant sound. The soft sound of a horn coming from nowhere. A melancholy, drawn-out sound that made his heart ache. The boss would stop, look around, but never saw anyone. It was as if the cowboy was still there, watching over the cattle, caring for what he loved until the end. The new cowboys said it was the wind. Others, older, whispered that it was the spirit of the cowboy who hadn't abandoned the land he had cared for so much. One of them even recounted that once he saw a silhouette on horseback in the distance, near the pasture, under the moonlight. He said the horse looked the same and the man wore a leather hat, just like the old cowboys. When he approached, he vanished like mist. After that, no one doubted it anymore. The backlands kept his presence. The boss, overcome by a mixture of regret and hope, began to talk to himself, asking forgiveness from the wind. He asked forgiveness from the cattle, the land, and above all, the man he had despised. On some nights, he would leave the corral gate open, as if expecting him to return. And the most curious thing is that on those nights, the cattle behaved differently. They remained quiet, gazing at the horizon, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Time passed, but the sound of the cattle horn never disappeared. Sometimes, when the full moon illuminated the backlands, the sound echoed again, louder, more present, and those who heard it swore they could smell the scent of leather and wet earth, as if the cowboy were there, calling the cattle for another round of work. The boss, with teary eyes, understood that it wasn't a punishment. It was a vivid memory. It was the backlands showing that the soul of that man had never truly left. The people of the region began to tell stories. They said that the cowboy appeared on moonlit nights, mounted on his white horse with the same serene and firm gaze. They said that the cattle gathered around him, mooing softly as if they were conversing. And in the morning, the pasture was greener, the cattle calmer, as if they had been cared for during the night. The boss then began to believe that the cowboy's love had transcended time, scorn, and even death. The backlands, which sees and keeps everything, decided not to forget him, because there are men who become part of the land they love, and the land, in gratitude, never lets them disappear. The cowboy became legend, became wind, became sound. And in every corner of the backlands, when the silence is too profound, the echo of the cattle horn can still be heard. It is the cowboy returning, not out of obligation, but out of love. The chief grew old in silence, and they say he died listening to that same sound. Some believe that in his last moments he smiled. Perhaps he saw the cowboy coming to meet him, mounted, serene, silently forgiving the man who had scorned him. Since then, the people swear that on full moon nights, the farm shines differently, as if the entire backlands bow in respect to the soul of a man who never stopped caring for what was his. And if you've made it this far, feeling your heart tighten, tell me in the comments, do you believe that true love never dies? Right, the cowboy still lives in the backlands. So I know that this story touched your heart as it touched mine.